an effort to present within 15 minutes. What I would suggest is that we use the time up till 3 o'clock maybe for questions and answers, and you pick up some of the points that you wanted to maybe spell out in a little more detail during the presentation in that discussion round. We will then have a short break for coffee and tea just downstairs before we resume with an entirely new panel with Elmar Brok still coming, Ahmad Yang, who's now quickly left, and Małgorzata Wasilewska from the ES. So, but first, whom in the audience, and I would like to collect maybe a few points, would like to ask a question. 1, 2, start with 3. Anyone? 3. Okay. Are there something you want to...
I will respond to Emma's last point as well.
All right, very good. I think the room is small enough to just, carry your own voice. Could you briefly state whom you are, whom you represent, and make your point clearly and concise? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Gábor Tóth. I'm from the Hungarian Parliament Organization. I'm dealing with CEPS issues. It means the civilian crisis management missions. After the kind words of György, I should take the floor and thank you very much to him and to all of you who had participated in the compilation of this report. It's a very good report, I think. I have read it last night. I found the recommendations quite good. We can use in the future for our work, for example, the external service review, the crisis management procedures review. We will have at least one new mission to Libya before June, and maybe another one in Syria, who knows. And we'll have a defense council meeting in December, so all these issues can be raised at very high level, I think. And regarding our supportive role, my government remains supportive in this context, including the Legal Center and also your work, the task force work. As you may remember, it is very high topic for us. From our EU presidency, we had a follow-up to the Göteborg issues, the conflict prevention. We have had the Wallenberg memorial year last year, and also a lot of other issues. We have established the center, so we remain supportive, and thank you for your presentation, and we share all your recommendations, and we will try to implement it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so member state support, you know where to shop. Very good. Gentlemen there.
Yes, my name is Michael Kambeck. I'm from European Friends of Armenia. And first of all, I would also like to thank you very much for the presentation. I have 2 points. The first one, from our work, of course we have mass atrocity in the past which we are somehow concerned with, namely the Armenian genocide, though we are not a diaspora organization, so we don't focus on it that much. We're much more concerned about the present and the imminent future. And of course, in that context, my question, you were talking about the fact that conflict prevention and mass atrocities should not be linked too much with each other. And in this context, I mean, of course, especially for the Armenians, there have always been kind of a ping-pong between first the mass atrocity, then again kind of a reaction, and then you go back into a conflict situation, and it's like the two are very much linked to each other, and it seems to be very difficult to break out of a certain cycle. So I was wondering if you had a comment about that. And the second thing, I absolutely love your recommendation 3. I think it was 3. The one which also Emma Bonino referred to, namely the political will that is needed, because also from our work we have been alerting certain stakeholders, and we receive the feedback, yes, so in this context, for example, the Nagorno-Karabakh question is becoming very, very hot. again. And then if you ask, okay, so what is going to happen? You see almost nothing, or you know, it's just very nice words, but there is no real attention. And we had a similar situation before the so-called Arab Spring, when the NGOs active in those countries have been ringing alarm bells for a long time, saying, you know, there's something cooking here. And the EU institutions were saying, yes, we're aware of it, and we want to redouble, and then they didn't, or they were very slow to react. So my question is, where do you see this, this step taking place of having a stronger accountability? Is there any way, for example, if you say, you know, you could appoint a local representative, I think you would need a political partner. If you don't find that partner, and I don't think you will ever find that partner in all capitals, maybe you can find it in the European Parliament, because it's the most political player in town, and maybe that is the only one who's kind of the watchdog of the EAS, of the whole system, and that can play that role. But I was wondering if you could comment on that as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The lady here in front.
My name is Gaia Pellegrini-Bettoli. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I'll try to keep it very short.
Who do you represent?
The Atlantic Treaty Association. Just one, again, I agree with you completely. I think point 3 is essential. I was in the Sahel region last year, and what has happened now, we've known for years. We've known probably for a decade. So again, that you've hit the nail on the head. I agree completely. I was just wondering one thing, and I haven't read your report yet, but I shall. Do you include the issue of dual-use technology? Because that can actually be a way that the EU and EU companies and the private sector can help or hinder the situation on the ground. Thank you very much.
Okay, 3 points, Christoph, and feel free to throw in the extra one.
Yes, thank you very much for your comments. I think there's one. I think I'll start with the first point related to devolving some authority downwards. Of course, that came up, and it also came up in the comments from Emma Bonino. I think it's useful to clarify what I mean here. The underlying problem is that most organizations, certainly most foreign affairs organizations, and I certainly include the much bigger EAS in it, are slow in decision making. It's because of the way they operate, their standard operation procedure. And the way in which everyone tries to be consistent and coherent can get in the way of responding and responding earlier. And sometimes it's better to respond earlier in a not perfect and not coordinated fashion than to wait for the green light from the top and to have everything lined up, because it will be too late at that stage. And that's a major problem for any kind of preventive response. So the evidence we have from some of the cases, for instance, Darfur, is that when you look at some of the actors on the ground, and I'm talking here about the US and the experience of USID in particular, but also some of the ambassadors, is that they have been able to make a difference locally. USID was able to disperse money very quickly in response to the escalation of violence in Darfur, because the local administrator had an understanding of the situation and was able to act, had the authority to act. Now, interestingly enough, Emma Bonino, as former head of ECHO, also had that authority to act without necessarily having to ask everyone around the table to do something. So the more you kind of bring in these units that have some authority to act into a kind of perfect decision-making chain, the more you increase the chances of delays, of bottlenecks. And it's good to think about what types of instruments can be deployed at what type of level. So I'm not talking about an ambassador legitimizing military intervention. I'm thinking about what are the instruments that you could give to actors such as USID or ECHO or some other actors that operate underneath, kind of without full authorization of the Foreign Affairs Council or the High Representative, that they can use in a relatively quick but also a relatively low-risk way. So this could be kind of dispersing money very in a targeted, tailored fashion to alleviate particular problems that could escalate. It could also mean that heads of delegations can use kind of diplomacy with local leaders and feel empowered and trained to do so at an earlier level. And that could involve networks of heads of delegations with ambassadors, national ambassadors, and we've come across cases of those kind of intervention that you never see highlighted in the media, but where these heads of delegations and ambassadors have made an impact on local leaders and have persuaded them to refrain from particular action or have highlighted to them particular risks. So I'm not talking about devolving the whole toolbox of instruments downwards. I'm talking about thinking more about what type of authority could you give to agencies or to local actors that could make a difference on the ground, even if it's not perfect. So I think there is good evidence to suggest that giving some sort of autonomy can make a difference in specific cases. At the same time, accountability, I agree with that, with the point made there, that there has to be political accountability, certainly when it comes to using the high-risk scenarios and when it comes to crises that have escalated. So you need to have someone who does that, and I think the European Parliament is the most obvious candidate, but I think there needs to be also more development of, I suppose, the civil society side. APLO is, of course, an umbrella organization of different NGOs and peace building, and I think if there was also a stronger debate amongst NGOs and stronger sorts of organization amongst NGOs, I think they could also play a very, very important role in holding decision makers to account. But I think lastly, the problem is partly because you don't have these decision-making forcing points. So if you don't have regular intervals when decisions either are made or are not made, then there is no proper way of holding people accountable. So having a regular point at which decision makers, PSC or Foreign Affairs Council, have to consider upstream issues and take a decision on them, either to act or not to act, is, I think, a good moment for pinpointing that accountability. And without that pinpointing, there's always a risk of saying, well, I'll look at, I'll focus on the crocodile near the canoe and not the waterfall down the river. So the real issues that are maybe upstream. Why do I think, why do we think that conflict prevention and mass atrocity prevention are conceptually distinct? I think there are a number of issues. Firstly, I do agree that you empirically, very often there is a correlation, there's a coincidence of conflict with mass atrocities. They do often occur together. There are 20% of cases where they occur outside of conflict, and that is, I think, one of the arguments we've made. But I think there's also, I suppose, a more fundamental reason for why it's different, and that fundamental reason has to do with legitimacy. Mass atrocities are crimes. They have to be prevented under all circumstances. When we're talking about violent conflict, there are all sorts of legitimate reasons why particular people take up arms. So just to say we don't want conflict, we don't want violent conflict, is from a normative perspective a slightly problematic assumption. In terms of responses, there can be also quite different responses that you have whether you adopt a conflict prevention lens, which talks about neutrality, which talks about bringing people around the table again. And you've seen that in a couple of cases where policymakers had a conflict prevention lens on and said, oh, well, we are focused on this peace process and we don't want to derail the peace process, rather than focusing on coming down on the perpetrators of mass atrocities and giving a clear message to them. So it does matter what kind of lens you carry, and yes, there are synergies, and I'm not saying this should be a completely different track. This is not meant to be a new silo, the people who do mass atrocity prevention. I'm very much in favor of integrating that into EU decision making. I don't want this to be sidelined, but at the same time, you need to have that specific lens. Otherwise, it will not make a sufficient difference. Yes, and finally, my last point, maybe on the issue of political will. It is repeated over and over again that warning is not the problem, and it's all a problem of will. We would argue that political will is not monolithic, it's malleable, it can change, and it is partly a function of how those who are providing the knowledge, those who are active in advocacy, make the case whether or not that political will can be mobilized and activated. And we do sometimes risk a little bit of hindsight bias when we go back to the cases that we know that have exploded, and we only see those who said, oh, we knew this all along. This may be the case in some cases, but in other instances, such as Rwanda, such as Darfur, it was actually very, very difficult to spot what was going to happen. These were genuinely surprising developments for many of the observers. So we should not try, we need to be sensitive to how difficult sometimes forecasting is. And we can't just go back and say, well, we can't just go back to those who got it right. And then ignore the whole context of information that was out there at the time. And that makes it sometimes difficult for decision makers to know who's right, because you often only know afterwards.
Okay. In view of the time, quick round still, very short points and quick answers at this stage, and then we go for a coffee break, and there may be another opportunity after the break to quiz one another. 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, James Smith from the Aegis Trust. On the accountability, did you consider the role of parliamentarians?
So you back?
Marko Rakovic, Slovenia National Focal Point for R2P. So many thanks for convening today's meeting and congratulations for the excellent report. It's in a very timely manner, and well, we think, you know, as you mentioned, that EU is already doing a lot and devoting many resources to the mass atrocity prevention and doing many activities. But sometimes there is difficult to streamline the policies to get the best results. And so you mentioned there is a potential for better coordination, and so internal and external with other international partners. So maybe can you elaborate a little bit more on this? And the other issue that you mentioned, it's paramount for states to do their job, to stimulate discussions. And I would like to inform that Slovenia in this respect is convening a meeting of focal points on 10 April. And we hope that with this discussion we can somehow further the mass atrocities prevention discussion and put EU, as you mentioned, should play a key role in this process on that spot. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gentleman in the back.
Thank you. I'm Sébastien Mabot from Save for the World. Just wanted to say that even though we come from a conflict prevention peace building angle, we share a lot of your assessment findings. And just wanted to say a quick thing on the response side of things, and especially on local capacities. So you're saying that we need to reinforce local capacities of the EU in country to deal with these issues, which basically I very much agree, and especially monitoring how these issues are developing, and especially conflict dynamics and so on and so forth. I just wanted to stress the fact that it's equally important to also focus on in-country local actors and their capacities to anticipate how conflict dynamics evolve and to respond to these conflict dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you. Point taken. Last, very shortly.
James Kearney, UNA UK. Christoph, thank you for your presentation. Thanks for the report. Very quick question. Mechanisms are all very, very important and take it to a certain level, but political dynamism is also required to really take things forward, particularly when things get very, very bad. Is there something over the next 5 to 10 years that could be taken, a decision could be taken at the Council of Ministers level, which would at least give some sort of political nuanced stability or proaction, and what would that translate into in terms of being able to respond to atrocities more quickly and more effectively?
Thanks very much. Christoph, a number of points fired at you.
Yeah, thank you. The first point on the role of parliamentarians in enforcing accountability. We have had interviews with parliamentarians, both European parliamentarians in Brussels as well as parliamentarians in some of the member states. and clearly they are very, very important for getting information out of the system, so the question of who knows what when, and providing a channel for advocacy before something happens. And we've seen that in a number of cases that the parliamentarians have submitted written questions, and that that there are all parliamentary groups in some countries. So this is very important. It is just sometimes a function of these reports that you can't cover all areas of recommendations equally well. But I would totally agree with you that this can't be just a question of bureaucracies and officials. This has to have a strong political dimension. Someone has to channel that accountability politically. So I agree with you that, and probably we could have done more to elaborate on that. Streamlining policy making and better coordination with other actors. It is probably an area where we could be a little bit more specific than we have been, but it is also an area that is where it is very difficult to be specific on how exactly that cooperation could develop. I mean, one of the areas of cooperation is clearly with the UN's advisor on genocide, and the other area is, I think, with the US, where you have an administration which has really prioritized this issue and has done a lot of work, but hasn't really found that much of a partner in the EU so far. So I think there is a question of where are the areas where there is duplication, where are the areas where the EU could work more closely with the US. And I think that's an important area to build on and to focus on. But I think the EU needs to be taken serious first. So I think if the EU does some first steps, then I think there's a basis for better cooperating with the US. Cooperation, I think, is also very important with what Sebastian Barbeau mentioned, with local actors. So I think one of the key principles of designing early warning response systems is to do it at the lowest level possible, because local actors have the strongest interest in preventing these crimes, and they often have capacities that international actors do not have. So I agree that whenever possible, there should be, the first look should be at what does it take for building up local capacities. Now, this shouldn't be an exercise of kind of shifting responsibility elsewhere and kind of giving, kind of believing in organizations who we know will not do the job. But I think over time, some of these organizations, whether it's kind of citizens, community-based early warning and response systems, or regional organizations, they are the proper, legitimate, and most effective bodies to make a difference. I'm grateful for the comment from the Slovenian representative. So it seems that there are already some member states here that are supportive of some of our recommendations. And maybe on the last question, what kind of decision could be taken? I mean, Foreign Affairs Council conclusions would be a very good step if we could get these conclusions on mass atrocity prevention and the strategy towards them. But I think that wouldn't be enough. It would be good to have some sort of a process, some sort of a follow-up. So if one had a kind of a structured process towards building a European consensus on mass atrocity prevention, then to have a kind of maybe not necessarily an annual, but maybe biannual update, a kind of progress report on what has happened, one could put in place some sort of process that would not peter out and would be more consistent and continuous than kind of a one-shot document or one-shot decision. So that would be my initial response to that.
Thank you very much, Christoph. We'll put that last point to some of the speakers in the second panel for sure, and see what the answer to that question. What I would suggest now is that we break for coffee and tea, which you can get by just exiting this room and then the stairs down a few flights.